Good day. Today is Thursday, 15th January 2026. And before I proceed with this program, let me remind you to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this video or whichever part of this video you want to watch, you decide that you've liked what you've heard and you wish to indicate this fact. Now, let me start this program first by discussing the situation with respect to Iran, and I'm going to suggest that the best explanation for some of the things that took place over the last 24 hours is that the shadow of Moscow has now fallen over Iran and the Persian Gulf, and that it is the entry of Russia which is now starting to change the strategic calculus. Now, in saying all of this, I think it's important to understand and to work through the events of the last 24 hours. For much of yesterday, the accumulation of reports strongly suggested that some kind of American military strike against Iran was about to happen. There were reports that the British were closing their embassy in Iran and were evacuating their people from Iran. There were reports that other Western countries, European countries, were starting to do the same. There were reports, in fact, there weren't reports, there were statements from the United States urging all of their citizens to leave Iran and, interestingly, Russia as well, which is a telltale pointer to what was happening, which I think we will see the explanations of it as we proceed with the events as they took place. But anyway, there were those announcements. There were reports from Reuters, which I discussed in my program yesterday, that the Israelis and others believed that the United States was on the brink of carrying out an attack against Iran. And last but not least, the Iranian authorities also seem to be taking some precautionary steps of their own, or preparatory steps of their own. Firstly, there were very strong statements made by certain Iranian military officials about the counteraction that the Iranians would take in the event that there was an American strike against them. And then there were also reports that Iran had closed its airspace. And lastly, there were also reports that the Iranian Air Force, such of it as exists, had taken a flight from its air bases and that Iranian aircraft were in the sky. The last, by the way, would not, I think, have been in order to engage the far more powerful US and Israeli air forces in direct combat or anything of that sort, or even to shoot down American missiles and drones. Rather, it would have been to preserve the Air Force assets by getting them away from the bases, given the very strong likelihood that it would have been the aircraft bases themselves which would have been amongst the things that the Americans and the Israelis would have attacked in a first strike. So one can see that all of the indications were that we were heading towards some kind of major military clash, and all of the pieces seem to be falling into place. And then we got a statement from the President of the United States saying that he'd received information from Iran that the Iranian authorities were not moving forward with the executions they were intending to carry out yesterday. By the way, about that, he's right. and I'm going to return to that shortly. Anyway, that the Iranian authorities were not moving forward with those executions, and for that reason, he gave the impression that the United States would not be conducting an immediate strike on Iran, though he conspicuously left the option to conduct such a strike open. And then over the next few hours, telltale signs of a de-escalation began to grow, though it is essential to say that the crisis is far from ended. There are reports that a US Navy carrier group, led by the US Navy carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, is being redeployed to the Persian Gulf area from the South China Sea. It may take a week, perhaps, to arrive in station, and presumably when it does, it will need some time to prepare for a military attack against Iran, if that is indeed the plan. So perhaps we're looking at a week to 10 days before more American military assets arrive on the scene. And there are reports this morning in the media in the United States that the United States is also planning or considering attacks on Iran using Tomahawk missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and also aircraft, long-range aircraft, based in the continental United States itself. In other words, strategic bombers, B-2 bombers of the kind that were used in the attack on Fordow and the other Iranian nuclear facilities during the 12-day war back in June. Perhaps other older bombers, B-1s and even B-52s as well. So the pieces still appear to be moving into place, but the president, Donald Trump, did signal a short-term de-escalation, and over the last couple of hours, the situation appears to have quieted. Now, we have had reports, there's an article in the Financial Times today, that Arab allies of the United States, the Gulf states, have been urgently advising the administration to call off the strike on Iran. They don't want to see a larger crisis which could disrupt the oil market, and above all, they do not want to see the Iranians take steps to close the Straits of Hormuz, which the Iranians apparently seriously considered doing during the 12-day war back in June. If the Straits of Hormuz were closed, obviously it would have a big effect on oil markets. It would mean a significant rise in the price of oil, to put it mildly, but it would also block exports by Arab oil producers who ship most of their oil, the far and away the greater part of their oil, through the Gulf, and specifically through the Straits of Hormuz. And of course, if there was an interruption, a long-term interruption in their ability to ship oil around the world, well, that would have a devastating impact on their economy, on their economies, and perhaps in the medium to long term, their internal stability as well. So one can understand why the Gulf states, putting aside their many other concerns, were extremely alarmed by the proposals for an American strike against Iran. It's interesting to see how the Gulf states, and by the way, Saudi Arabia, who not so long ago were amongst the biggest advocates of a strike against Iran, have, after reconsidering the matter, now changed their stance and have become increasingly opponents of this idea. Anyway, so we have a stabilization at the moment. Now, the Financial Times article says that there has been intervention by another side, and we're told that an Arab official has told the Financial Times that hopes were now growing, that communication between there was communication between Tehran and Washington, some of which may have been assisted by a third party such as Russia or Oman, and this could develop into further talks in the coming days. Notice that amongst the two countries that are mentioned here, alongside Oman, there is a reference to Russia. Now, this is consistent with what we have seen. I discussed 2 days ago, and in fact in my program yesterday also, the fact that one of the things, in fact the key to the Iranian authorities' success in quelling the protest movement in Iran was the internet blackout and the cutting off of the mobile phones, but mostly and most importantly, the jamming of the Starlink terminals in Iran. Now, there continues to be some discussion as to who provided Iran, not just with the technology, but I suspect the means to jam the Starlink terminals. Iran clearly did not have these means at the time of the June 2025 12-day war. The Russians or the Chinese do have this level of expertise, and they would be in a position to provide the technology to Iran. But even allowing for the fact that Iran is in many respects a sophisticated country with many effective people with good technical backgrounds, I wonder whether the Iranian authorities would have had the ability to assimilate and absorb and use this technology in the relatively short time since it was provided back in June. Just saying. And Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has pointed out that it can take quite a long time before a country that has been provided with a sophisticated technology or a sophisticated weapon system can fully absorb it and understand how to use it effectively. That strongly suggests to me that there are people on the ground from either Russia or China, or conceivably both, who are assisting the Iranians to use this technology, and that over the last couple of days, these people were put into action. Now, I'm going to suggest that this also tilts the balance towards the Russians as the players in this game. China undoubtedly does have this technology, but in my experience, they tend to be restrained, to put it mildly, about putting their people in harm's way. And I have heard that the Russians had been asked to provide this technology by the Iranians in the past, but the Russians had been unwilling to do this because of worries that if they did, it would fall into American hands. But of course, if the Russians have sent their own people and are running this operation in Iran themselves, then that might mitigate against that concern. And also, if I may say, it would also be much more consistent with what I know of what the Russians do. The Russians have in the past regularly shown a willingness to send people into dangerous situations, more so than up to now the Chinese have done. Now, to be clear, I don't know for a fact that it was the Russians. It might have been the Chinese. And whatever the Russians do, the Chinese obviously know about it. And I'm sure that they approve and agree to it. And if the Chinese are involved in Iran, the Russians will know about it and will be approving and supporting it. And it could even be that both of them are working at the same time. But it seems to me more likely that since we're talking about Iran, a country closer to Russia in some ways, that it is the Russians themselves, who are present in Iran at this time. And by the way, that would be a major concession from the Iranians as well. The Iranians have many times, very often in fact, shown great reluctance indeed, great unease about allowing outsiders to play roles in their military and security systems. Internally, I remember how back in 2015, there was a huge uproar in Iran when it turned out that the Russians were using Iranian air bases to support their contingent in Syria. And there was a big outcry and complaints in the Iranian parliament about it, and the arrangement had to be cancelled, which I know annoyed the Russians a lot. So the Iranians are very, very reluctant to bringing people from the outside into Iran, but it could be that sensing, in fact, all of the facts, all of the elements suggest that the Iranians probably understanding that a repetition of the regime change attempt that was made in June 2025 was coming, that they felt that they had no choice, that they allowed the Russians to come in and to operate the jamming systems that blocked the Starlink terminals, and that is what happened. Now, I should say that Alistair Crook, former British diplomat, somebody with vast experience of the Middle East, somebody who knows the Iranians very well and speaks their language, and somebody who knows the Arab world very well and speaks the language there, and somebody who also knows Israel very well, and whose wife also speaks Hebrew, and the two of them together monitor very closely the Israeli media, the Hebrew language Israeli media. Anyway, Alistair Crook has said publicly that following the meeting that took place between Trump and Netanyahu on, I believe, the 28th of December, the Israeli media, especially the Hebrew language Israeli media, was saying unequivocally that Donald Trump gave Israel the green light to renew the operation, complete the unfinished business from the June 2025 war, the unfinished business to achieve regime change in Iran. And when I talk about unfinished business, and I've discussed this in many programs, notice this article today in the Financial Times. So I'm not going to read it through, but just notice the title, Israel waits on US to settle unfinished business with Iran. And the words unfinished business are in quotation marks. And of course, the unfinished business, when you go on to read the article, it's fairly clear that it is toppling the Tehran regime, as the Financial Times article essentially says. So, according to the Israeli media, Trump gave Netanyahu the green light to move forward with another regime change attempt. And, well, on the back of the entirely understandable protests that took place in Iran over the very difficult economic situation there, and the mismanagement of the economic situation by the Iranian government, um, such a regime change attempt was made. And Alistair Crook, by the way, also says, and again, he is somebody far more informed about the situation on the ground than me. Anyway, he has corroborated the point that I've made, corroborated my deduction, I should say, because of course I am not on the ground, that the single thing that did enable the Iranian authorities to quell the protests so fast was the jamming of Starlink. And he also speaks about the extraordinary dismay, the alarm and shock that this has caused in Washington especially, but I suspect in Israel and elsewhere too. The assumption was that it would not be possible to interfere with Starlink, but clearly it was. Now, here I should say that we've had more information about the Iranian operation. Nobody is suggesting that Starlink coverage, Starlink use became impossible. What happened was that it was very severely degraded. Apparently, signals were jammed and interfered with all the time, so that every so often messages could be sent, but not on a regular basis, and that made it very difficult, all but impossible, for the various groups involved in Iran to communicate with each other or to communicate with whoever it was that they were working with abroad, just to say. So there was that, but it was also apparently possible to use the technology with which Iran was provided to track the dishes and the terminals within Iran, and the Iranian media has been full of pictures of seized Starlink terminals and of people being arrested. And by the way, there are reports, some reports to this effect in the media in the West too. So anyway, this took everybody by surprise. But the other key point about this is that it would have been seen in Washington and elsewhere as a Russian commitment. And again, I do think it was the Russians, a Russian commitment to Iran. And I'm going to suggest that this was probably what provoked some of the actions that had been taken by the United States as it became clear that Starlink was being switched off. This abrupt and so far unexplained announcement by President Trump that 25% tariffs were being imposed on all countries that maintain dealings with Iran. I don't think that this is going to surprise or concern the Russians very much, just to say, but it's the sort of petulant reaction that Donald Trump does make in these kind of situations. And I would also suggest that this also explains why Americans have been told to leave Russia. And by the way, there's also reports that the United States has announced that visas will not be provided as a result of a reorganization to citizens of certain countries. And I noticed that one country was Russia. Again, the duration of this is not made clear, but again, all of this looks to me like an angry reaction to what happened over the last couple of days. And, well, Russian involvement has not been limited to this. There are reports which are circulating. Again, we don't know exactly how true they are, but they're apparently circulating in Israel, that the Russians have contacted the Israeli government and told them to back off from involvement and attack on Iran. and that the Russians have told the Israelis in return that they will ensure that there is no aggressive steps taken but against Israel by Iran and its proxies. It is the sort of thing that the Russians might indeed do. We've had this further article in the Financial Times which talks about contacts between Iran and the United States mediated by a third party. I have no doubt that Oman, which has acted as a mediator and a conveyor of messages before, is doing the same at this time. But it would not surprise me if there is some degree of contact between the Russians and the Americans over Iran as well. But perhaps more importantly, I suspect that the Russians have been giving the Iranians a certain amount of advice. Donald Trump is absolutely correct in saying that the Iranians appear to have slowed down significantly the actions that they were taking or saying they were going to take against Iranian protesters. They are now, the judicial authorities in Iran are now heatedly denying that they had any plans to execute anybody on Wednesday, and specifically they are specifically denying that certain named individuals who were reported in the West as being in line to be executed on Wednesday were going to be executed. All I would say about that is that I follow the Iranian media very, very closely, and I've already made this known, and it was clearly seen to me that the Iranian authorities, including the Iranian judicial authorities, were showing every indication that they were indeed going to move rapidly towards taking these measures, perhaps on Wednesday, just to say. I mean, this change in rhetoric on this question from Iran has been both very great, and it has happened in a very abrupt way. And of course, and above and beyond that, the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that Iran has no plans to execute anyone. He spoke about the fact that the Iranians have no plans, that they're not going to use hanging, that has, as I understand it, been something that the Iranians have done in the past. I mean, it's part of their legal culture. Anyway, again, I wonder, and here again, I want to stress, I don't know, but I wonder whether they have been given very strong advice not to do this, and whether that strong advice came from Moscow not to do this. Firstly, it would be wrong in itself. Secondly, it would be far more likely to inflame the situation within Iran itself rather than pacify it. Thirdly, it would do massive damage to Iran's international reputation. And fourthly, it would deny Donald Trump the off-ramp that he might want to use to back off a strike against Iran at this time. Trump has spoken about the fact that he would take action to protect Iranian protesters. If the Iranians started to execute protesters, then he might find himself under immense pressure to act on that threat, stopping the executions, stopping this industrial line of executions that seem to be threatened, takes away that pretext. And by the way, that that cause which might have pushed Trump towards this action, and it's provided him with the off-ramp that he might have needed to back off at this time. So there is some speculation in all that I have just said. I am not, obviously, briefed about any of this by the Russians, by the Iranians, by the Americans, by the Arab Gulf states, or by anyone else. But I can read the various statements. I can see the shifts in changes. I think the key to understanding what has happened has been the failure of the Starlink system. That does seem to me to point clearly to Moscow, and it does seem to me that all of this points to the Russians in some way being involved. There is something else as well, by the way, though one should be careful here because this is a deduction based on a negative fact. So far, the Russians and the Iranians are conspicuously failing to report contacts between each other. Now, that does seem to me very strange. The Russians have made very forthright public statements against any attack on Iran and any attempted regime change in Iran. There's been statements to this effect from the Russian Foreign Ministry. It would have been entirely natural for Pezeshkian or Arakchi to contact their opposite numbers in Moscow, Putin and Lavrov. We've no word so far that anything like that has happened, and that does seem very strange. And I would suggest that, in fact, it probably means the opposite, that there's been a great deal of communication between Moscow and Iran, but that the Russians and the Iranians don't want to highlight the extent of this because there's a complex game being played, a diplomatic game being played at the moment, and it is in the interests of everyone to keep as quiet about it as possible. Anyway, there we are. For the moment at least, it looks as if we have a pause. But it is a pause. The unfinished business that the Financial Times spoke about, and which I've spoken about, the achievement of regime change in Iran, is still unfinished. There are reports in the United States that President Trump had a meeting with his national security team and told them that he would only countenance an attack on Iran if it guaranteed regime change in that country. He does not want a long, drawn-out war. He does not want any suggestion of American boots on the ground. He wants a quick regime change operation, bringing down the Iranian government, and he wants any military action to guarantee that. Well, I put aside the question here of why Donald Trump imagines that regime change in Iran would be beneficial to the United States. I personally think in the long term it would be a disaster. Assuming that the present government in Iran collapsed, I strongly suspect that we would see a major and prolonged crisis in the country. Reuters has talked about the present government still having a big political constituency in Iran. There are the security forces, which are large and very well armed, and some of the people there, if there was a regime change, would probably retreat into the mountains and would probably and quite plausibly conduct long-term resistance there because, well, to say it simply, their backs would be to the wall. I can very easily see how we could end up with a crisis in Iran far greater than anything that we have experienced up to now. But anyway, put all that aside. Assume that Donald Trump doesn't understand that, and he really does believe that the people of Iran are yearning for the return of the monarchy and the crown prince and all of that. The key point to say is that he wants regime change in Iran. The objective now, the President of the United States is discussing with his own national security team, which the Israelis are openly now signed up with, is, as the Financial Times puts it, the toppling of the regime in Tehran. So the objective is regime change. We've moved very far from the situation in June, where it was all supposed to be about Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Now it is straightforwardly regime change. There are other excuses thrown in, or reasons thrown in, like ending Iran's ballistic missile program and all of that. But it's clear that the ultimate objective is to try to change Iran's government and to replace the current government with a pro-Western government, a pro-American and pro-Western government, and, by the way, to deal a blow to the BRICS. Anyway, that's the objective, but Trump apparently does not want to be drawn into anything that might resemble a long war. He remembers Iraq and the disaster that turned out to be. He perhaps knows a little bit about Libya too, and even Syria. I suspect at the back of his mind must be the great war of his youth, the war in Vietnam, and he probably remembers how incredibly divisive and destructive of politics within the United States that was, and perhaps he even has some glimmers of knowledge of the extent to which the war in Vietnam caused major problems for the US economy, which have not been fully overcome to this day. So he does not want to be dragged into a long-term struggle, but he still wants regime change. That tells us that the situation remains very unstable. If he feels that an attack can achieve regime change, he might very easily and quite probably authorize it. What I would say, however, is that assuming that this report is true and assuming that it does indeed reflect his genuine sentiments, if the Iranian authorities are able to achieve long-term stabilization in Iran, which is not just control of the streets via the security forces, but stabilization of the economic situation. And if they continue to develop the security relationships with Russia and, by the way, here also with China, that we are now starting to see, then there is a possibility that the threat of regime change, the threat of an attack on Iran might start to recede. And, by the way, the elements to do this are in place. Now, let me return again to the situation with the collapse of the rial that took place 2 or 3 weeks ago. I've discussed in many places how the collapse of the currency is partly a product of monetary and financial and economic mismanagement in Iran, which has been long-standing, but which has been aggravated by the policies of President Pezeshkian and his officials, which are not properly thought through and not properly implemented either. I noticed that Alistair Crook, to say this again, has far greater knowledge of Iran than I do, has said the same thing. I also now accept that probably the collapse of the Iranian currency was artificially engineered. Alistair Crook also spoke about a major shorting of the Iranian currency in the financial markets in Dubai, and that this was what precipitated the sudden crash, and that it was arranged as part of this renewed operation to topple the government in Iran that Netanyahu and Trump discussed over the course of their recent meeting in December. Now, Alistair Crook said something else which I'd sort of heard of, but I didn't fully know, but it does appear as if it is true, which is that China has already made it clear to Iran, made it clear long ago, that if the Iranians were in need of financial assistance to smooth over a crisis, China is willing to step in. There have been those assurances already given, and money can be provided to Iran very quickly through the existing financial institutions that the BRICS have created, and it can be provided directly by China itself. Now, the sums of money that would have been involved would have been very small. In a program that Alex Christoforou and I have done for the Duran, which has not yet been published, I spoke of Iran publicly asking China for $1 billion to stabilize the rial. My own view is that not only would that have been enough, it would have been far more than enough. Given the kind of currency the rial is, I doubt that it would have taken more than $100 or $200 million of intervention to achieve stabilization. As Alistair Crook says absolutely correctly, done properly, and the Chinese know exactly how to do it properly, China, if it stepped in that kind of way, could have come out with a profit. And going back to the sort of things that Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who knows more about stabilizing currencies than any other human being on planet Earth, the sums of money involved here are generally very small. The mere fact that China was stepping in would have been enough in itself to cause a stabilization, both of the currency and of the mood in Iran. We would have not only seen the currency stabilize, we would have probably started to see the first stabilization in the domestic economy and the first signs that inflation inside Iran was starting to fall. All it needed was a telephone call to Beijing. There is no sign that this was ever made. None of the officials in the Iranian government appear to have considered that option. Instead, we got a catalogue of statements, including from the Iranian government, that this is all caused by sanctions, and in this situation, the space for maneuver that the Iranian authorities had was very limited, and that there was very, very little that they could do. Saying that sort of thing, obviously, is not going to restore confidence. It is going to undermine it. When there is something you can do, it makes little sense to go out and talk in that way. Iran has become very accustomed over the last 40 years of trying to do everything by itself. It is now a member of BRICS. It should take advantage of that fact. It should take more advantage of that fact. than it is doing. And if it did it, then not only would it stabilize its own domestic situation, it would also probably create the conditions where the kind of regime change operations that we saw in June, and which I have no doubt we have seen play out this month, would begin to look so difficult that probably the US would start to walk back on them. Just say. Anyway, that is all I am going to say about the situation in Iran at the moment. My own sense is that we are in a moment of perhaps brief stabilization. How things play out over the next few weeks depends, I suspect, on decisions that need to be made in Tehran itself. But Iran is not without friends. It needs to let its friends help it. And by the way, it needs to listen to them about questions of its own internal governance. It needs to address the criticisms that are coming from within Iranian society as well. And if all of that happens, well, we might start seeing a way through. If they fail to do these things, then the next attack, which will certainly come at some point in the next few months, will be more powerful and better prepared and organized than the one we have just seen. Anyway, that's my discussion about the situation in Iran. Now, the other big conflict, the one in Ukraine, continues. And, well, we've had a significant amount of further news over the last 24 hours. And, well, suffice to say that the Russians not only continue their advance, but they continue the blackout of Ukrainian cities. The Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, is now engaged in an open row with the mayor of Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, over the situation in Kiev. Zelensky is blaming the blackout in Kiev on Klitschko. It's saying that Klitschko is responsible, so I can't generally see how. Zelensky has declared a state of emergency to address the situation in the energy system. This appears to involve importing more energy, gas, oil, electric power from Europe. That will help to a degree, but it cannot change the overall situation. And the Russians are in a move to counter any moves that the Ukrainians and the Europeans take in this regard. But above all, Zelensky is now busy. It's busy blaming the whole problem on Klitschko and saying that this is all his fault. Zelensky is also, incidentally, criticizing, not directly, but through people connected to him, Klitschko's urgent advice to people in Kiev to leave Kiev. There's a lot of talk about how this is all alarmist and wrong. Klitschko, for his part, is pushing back. So we can see that the recriminations and the arguments have begun. And I discussed in my program yesterday how President Zelensky seems to be refocusing or working to refocus the anti-corruption crisis, the anti-corruption scandal in Ukraine against his political rivals. I'm sure he's getting help from his European friends in doing this. There's the investigation of Yulia Tymoshenko that I discussed in my program yesterday. But there's been another move, a very interesting other move, the full details of which you can see explained in that invaluable Substack blog, Events in Ukraine. Because as part of the reorganization of Ukraine's internal security services, which we have seen being carried out over the last weeks, the shunting of Budanov from his post of head of military intelligence to Zelensky's chief of staff, the dismissal of Malyuk, the long-standing head of the SBU, the biggest internal security agency of all, and his replacement by somebody more closely aligned to Zelensky's old ally, the former chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. Well, alongside all of these various moves, according to events in Ukraine, another official has been appointed to the SBU, assuming a very senior role there, a role which appears to be connected to internal security issues. And this individual, you can learn all about him, as I said, by going to events in Ukraine, appears to be a very interesting man indeed, because apparently he has a history in Ukrainian law enforcement, in the police agencies, but he also apparently has a documented history, at least of allegations, of heavy involvement in Ukraine's organized crime networks. In fact, according to events in Ukraine, he's actually served a criminal conviction connected to his work for these organized crime networks. And events in Ukraine discusses all sorts of assertions that have been made about this individual, which strongly suggest a rather brutal and ruthless individual altogether, involved in all sorts of very troubling and disturbing things. I'm choosing my words carefully. And, well, somebody who does not seem to me to fit at all easily in an agency and organization involved or concerned with internal security. And yet, it seems as if this person has now been appointed to a very senior role by Zelensky, who has, by the way, given him decorations in the past. Now, here perhaps I can draw a little on my own historical knowledge. As the Second World War turned against them, the Germans carried out various reorganizations of the internal security organizations in various countries that they had previously occupied and where they had set up what you might call satellite governments. And one of the things they did was that they recruited into these agencies all sorts of very violent individuals connected with organized crime. If you know about the internal security services that were set up in Italy after the fall of the Mussolini government in 1943 by the German-backed government in the north, you would know all about this. And perhaps an even more well-known and sinister example is the creation of the Starlink, a extraordinarily violent internal security agency set up within France, which, by the way, not only recruited people with these kind of criminal backgrounds, but which, after the Second World War, in many cases saw many of those people involved in that organization return to those backgrounds. So it's the sort of thing that governments of this nature do when they sense that they are beginning to lose control and when they need people without inhibitions and with a reputation and a willingness to engage in acts of extreme ruthlessness in order to retain control. And that perhaps does point to how difficult the internal situation in Ukraine, in some respects, is becoming, and the steps that Zelensky and other officials close to him in Kiev are now taking to ensure that it is they who retain control of Ukraine, even as the crisis in Ukraine gets worse, and even as Ukraine could face over the next few months or perhaps year what might be its existential moment. So I think this is a very indicative appointment, perhaps the most interesting appointment that Zelensky has made up to now, even more indicative in some respects than the equally interesting appointment of Budanov to take Yermak's place as Zelensky's chief of staff, which, as I said already, appears to me to prepare the ground for the insurgency war that the plan is should be waged when the conventional fighting stops. Now, as I make this program, I should say that there are again reports of Russian strategic bombers moving into forward bases to prepare for an attack on Ukraine, and it is highly likely that we will get another big strike over the next few hours. And it could be that this will be the strike in which the Russians unveil and use for the first time the various new weapons, hypersonic missiles, and that sort of thing that we have seen spoken about so much over the last few days, and which I discussed in a video that I made 3 days ago. I ought to say that the Russians now pound Ukraine every night. Every night now there are missile and drone attacks. The scale of this is far greater than anything we have seen happen up to now. The drones are becoming more and more sophisticated, and anyway, the war in the sky is tilting further and further against Ukraine and in Russia's direction. Now, all of this continues alongside worsening information for the Ukrainians on the front lines. There's been more reports that General Teplinsky's group of forces, Dnieper, having captured Stepnogorsk, is now expanding the territories it controls, both to the north of Stepnogorsk, towards the city of Zaporozhye, but also eastwards as they work to cut off the town of Orechov. There was an interesting article, I think it was by Radovka, on the Russian side, which spoke about how the Russians are now cutting the supply routes to Orechov, basically from Zaporozhye, clearly in preparation for a siege and a storming of that important town. Perhaps even more interesting is that the Ukrainians themselves are now increasingly talking about a crisis in Konstantinovka, the big town to the east of Pakrovsk. The Ukrainians, until about a week ago, were still claiming that they were fighting in Pakrovsk, but I don't think anybody takes that seriously anymore, and the Ukrainians, I've noticed, are no longer making that claim. But anyway, the Russians appear to have broken into Konstantinovka from the west. It's too early to speak of a collapse of resistance in Konstantinovka. On the contrary, I suspect that there's still a lot of fighting to do. But it does seem as if the Russians are making significant progress in Konstantinovka as well. And further east still, um, the information is that the Russians are pushing westwards from Siversk, now at an accelerating pace. They seem to be getting closer and closer to the village of Raya Alexandrovka, which is the main important logistical and inhabited position that the Ukrainians still have west of the city of Slavyansk, which is the Russians' most important target. And the Russians also continue their operations further north in Liman and in Svyatogorsk, which I've discussed in recent programs. And I've noticed that some of the mappers have expanded the grey zone in Kupiansk. They've transferred places which they said was under Ukrainian control in Kupiansk. They brought them back into the grey zone, not yet under Russian control, but anyway. And of course the Russians have also crossed the border again in another place in Sumy region, and have captured a village there on the border, and nobody can quite work out what any of that means. But perhaps the most interesting thing that has happened over the last 24 hours is that the Ukrainian military chief, General Syrskyi, has now for the first time come out and said what has been obvious to me for several weeks, that the long-term objective of the Russians in the fighting in Ukraine is not to capture Kiev, but to capture Odessa instead. Obviously, the Russians are not going to capture Odessa tomorrow, though that city is now being heavily bombed. Blackouts take place there all the time. The port is now closed. Economic activity must have essentially ended, and around Odessa, the railways, the bridges are all being pounded night after night, and that there is an area to the west of Odessa, on the coast by the way, which is becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to occupy and hold. But even allowing for all of that, it is going to take the Russians a significant amount of time to reach Odessa. It's likely that we are looking at an operation that at its earliest might begin in the second half, probably the last quarter of this year. But the key to Odessa is the city of Zaporozhye. And I think this is what Syrskyi understands and what I have touched on in the past. If the Russians capture Zaporozhye city, then they are strategically positioned to cross the Dnieper. They can cross the Dnieper into southwestern Ukraine. That opens the way for them also to move towards Kherson and Kherson region, and they might also be in a position to advance on Kherson by crossing the Dnieper close to Kherson city. And there are many claims that the Russians have been systematically clearing the islands opposite Kherson and might even have established some footholds on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson, in the Kherson area as well. But the evidence of that is, to put it mildly, tenuous, and of course the Ukrainians deny it. Obviously, the capture of Zaporozhye city by itself would only be the start of an operation. There are two important cities in the way. One is Nikopol, and one is the very big city of Kryvyi Rog, with its big factories and its blast furnaces, all strong defensive positions. Though one does have to wonder, if the Russians do cross the Dnieper, what the state of the Ukrainian army defending these places is going to be. Anyway, the point is that if the Russians were to capture Zaporozhye, Odessa would not be on the close horizon, but it would be there in the distance. And if the Russians cross the Dnieper in Kherson region, and if these two operations were conducted at the same time, then an operation towards Odessa becomes, well, even more plausible, and certainly it starts to become or to look realistic. So, as I said, this is for the future, but it is interesting that Syrskyi is talking about this. My guess, just to repeat again, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't share its plans with me, and nor does Vladimir Putin. I think that Odessa is a much higher priority for the Russians than Kiev itself. If Ukraine's Black Sea coast were to fall under Russian control, the Russians would be in control of all of the Russian-speaking areas. Kiev would be reduced to a city which were the capital of a landlocked country without an economic hinterland. Quite plausibly, it would fall into the Russians' lap. So I can absolutely see how this might indeed be the Russian plan. And as I've said, Gerasimov, the Russian commander, once had a film made of himself with a map behind him showing Odessa under Russian control, which is a clear hint that that is the objective. And as I also discussed a few weeks ago, Putin met with the Russian generals in St. Petersburg, took them to the Peter and Paul Cathedral in the Peter and Paul Fortress, showed them the graves of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, the victors of wars in Ukraine, and the conquerors and founders of the cities of Sevastopol, Kherson, and Odessa, at least in the case of Catherine the Great. And, well, that, it seems to me, clearly pointed to this being the Russian objective. Now, in the midst of all of this, Witkoff and Kushner are supposed to be coming to Moscow. It is unclear completely what it is that they're going to be bringing with them. There is an extraordinary array of different proposals and different plans floating around. I'm unable myself to make out which plan, if any of these, continues to be the American plan and which plan Donald Trump is backing. When Trump was asked over the course of the press conference, where he said that he gave the impression that for the moment at least, a strike on Iran had been delayed, when he was asked who it was who was obstructing the movement towards peace in Ukraine, he said Zelensky. He did not say Vladimir Putin. So it could be that the Americans still have some hopes that they can persuade the Russians to stop, and that they are in the mood to make concessions to the Russians and perhaps to return to something of the spirit of anchorage. I have to say that reading the Russian media and reading comments by Russian officials, including, by the way, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, my own sense is that Witkoff and Kushner, if they do come to Moscow, perhaps next week, bringing this bewildering array of plans with them, are going to meet a polite but icy reception. I think that the Russians, I've already discussed that I sense that a major debate has been underway in Moscow over the Christmas and New Year holiday, I get the sense that the Russians have basically lost interest in this negotiation. They no longer believe it's going to lead to any conceivable outcome, and they no longer believe that Donald Trump is going to be the man to navigate the United States towards any kind of rapprochement with the Russians at all. The major Russian priority continues to be the war. All the indications point to this. I suspect that Kushner and Witkoff are now mostly functioning in a vacuum, though whether they themselves understand this is another matter. As for Europe, well, it's now definitely confirmed that the 90 billion euro loan has not been provided to Ukraine. I mentioned this yesterday. Ursula von der Leyen is now again saying that the question of the frozen Russian assets has not been conclusively settled. The assets might indeed be seized in order to repay the 90 billion euro loan that the Europeans are going to give to Ukraine. My own view about that, in light of what happened in December, the well-known legal objections provided to the European Union and the European states by a panoply of lawyers, which persuaded European governments to row back on the idea of using the Russian loans to float any kind of loan to the Russians. And in addition, in light of the legal action that the Russians are taking over the issue of their frozen assets, which is still underway, and which it's difficult to see how it can have anything else ultimately than success. My own view is that Ursula von der Leyen coming out and saying that, well, if the Russians won't pay the reparations loans and to repay the bondholders for the 90 billion euros, and if the Ukrainians won't pay the bondholders the capital on the on the loan either, well, in that case, we in Europe will pay it on using the frozen Russian assets to pay the capital that the bondholders are going to put forward. My own guess is that that's going to deter the bondholders, or rather the potential bondholders, from buying the bonds. Even if European governments, it's ultimately the European governments that are going to come forward to repay the loan and who will provide guarantees. If those guarantees are in any way connected to the frozen assets, then the investors, the international investment community, are going to say that lending money on this basis, even with the possibility that the money will be repaid even via third parties using assets belonging to Russia, which there is legal advice should not be seized, and which the Russians are now bringing legal cases about, doing that is far too high risk, and we're not going to touch these bonds. So I might be wrong here. You'll always find some people who are prepared to gamble, though if they do and do buy these bonds, I think it is a certainty that they're going to demand very high interest payments for the bonds, and they will get them. Anyway, we shall see what happens. But in Ukraine, my sense is that the Russians are in an implacable mood, that they're continuing to move west. And as for the Ukrainians, we're increasingly seeing that they're not only running out of options, but that Zelensky at least is taking precautions, is taking the first steps to protect himself for the difficult days that are about to come. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you, you can find all our programs on Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.